This is a Patch and Crash Hotfix episode. It's a format where we dive deep into a specific area of game development, so it's a little bit of a sideshow to the main podcast. Enjoy. Hello everybody and welcome to Patch and Crash, the podcast where gaming culture and life collide. And if you're watching the video version of this, it's going to be a little bit of a different show. It's a bit of a different crew and cast. It's me, Hans, here with my two friends, Björn and Mattias. Hi guys, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And Björn and Mattias are part of the Defold Foundation. And Defold is a game engine, and you are the stewards of the Defold game engine. So I wanted to introduce you guys, and I wanted to get you on here to talk a little bit about game engines in game, because it's a pretty big deal, a pretty big part of developing games. So Björn and Mattias, tell us a little bit about who you are and what Defold is.
All right, Mattias, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I'm Mattias, a developer of Defold Game Engine, and Defold Game Engine has been around for about 10 years, since 2009. It was created by two guys called Christian Murray and Ragnar Svensson. And they created the Defold Game Engine as a response to their prior experiences with other game engines and the troubles that you can have while developing a game. They saw a lot of, the troubles that you have to go through to create a game and also start a new game after the first game, etc. And so the base idea is to improve the life of a game developer.
Björn?
Yep. Hi guys. Yeah, so I'm Björn Ritzel. I'm the current product owner of Defold. So I'm gonna jump in where Mattias ended. So it started as a project created by Christian and Ragnar. It was an independent venture started by them, and in 2014, Defold was acquired by King, so the creators of Candy Crush and many other games. And at that time, King was looking around for a new engine to complement their already existing internal engine, and Defold fit the description. So they wanted a more artist-friendly engine and something that worked really well on mobile. So Christian and Ragnar and Defold was acquired by King in 2014, and it was used internally for a couple of years until it was released for free at GDC in 2016. So at that point in time, anyone could download and use it. It was no longer a subscription-based service as it was in the beginning. King has decided together with the team and Christian and Ragnar that it would be a nice gesture to basically give it away for free. There's obviously a bit of motivation behind such a move, of course, but and like one of the main ideas was, of course, to get more users testing it. It put a lot of requirements on having very up-to-date documentation and basically just getting it out there and getting more people to test it. And
by then, Unity was kind of a big deal as well, so it's kind of hard to compete with something that's growing as quickly as Unity was in 2016, I can imagine.
Yeah, exactly. So Unity was starting to make a name for itself at that point in time, and what's interesting, I mean, there was never any, idea of monetizing Defold or anything like that. It was given away for free and with limited marketing. And since 2016, we've seen growth, organic growth, and users coming in and using Defold, and the external user base has grown since 2016, and we now have a lot of teams using Defold, and that also made us transition Defold from an internal tool at King to to how it's run now as a totally independent legal entity in the Defold Foundation.
Right. So it went kind of from a closed source proprietary engine to something that is, I mean, open source in a way. Open source has a lot of weird definitions to it. Depends on who you ask. It's more you're not allowed to sell the source, and that in some people's imagination makes it not really open source. So it's source available. That's what it's called on the website, right? So you can download the entire source for the engine and play around with it and develop it further. And that's kind of interesting because, like, game engines, the history of game engines goes back, way far. I don't know, like original Quake and Quake 2 were kind of big game engines that were licensed to other games. And it used to be like a license for a game engine is $1 million, right? That's just like the base license cost of a game engine. Up until today, where we have open source game engines and we have a plethora of different types of game engines they can use. So, I mean, we still need to kind of clarify what a game engine is. It's something that is fundamentally important to game development. Every game has a game engine, basically. And Mattias, maybe you can talk a little bit about like what makes a game engine.
Well, I think if you look at it from each game development point of view, once you've actually managed to release a game, your first game, you wrote your game code from scratch, and you built something that you could release. Then comes the problem of making a second game, and what should you do? Should you rewrite all the code again, or should you reuse some parts? Can you reuse any of the tools that you created, etc.? And that's the part where the actual concept of an engine comes into play, I think, where you can actually start reusing more and more from a previous project. I mean, sometimes we might not even call it an engine if it's just a bunch of code, perhaps, but I would say that it's a gray definition line there. But it comes down to reusing things from the past to learn from your mistakes so you can continue developing in a faster fashion, or in a fashion that suits you or your game.
Right, maybe it's a branding thing, though. Maybe it's just as soon as you put a name on something, it's a game engine. Before that, it's just a tool set.
Yeah, and eventually, when you look at successful game engines, such as the one from id Software, they can continue. Suddenly, people understand that, hey, we can't actually write all this code. It takes too much time, and we don't have the knowledge. It will cost too much money to do it. Hey, guys, can we buy a license to your engine and have some support? I think that's how it started to make the source or the tools available outside of your own company. That's how it started. And I think each game basically needs their own specific tool set to create that particular game as well as possible. So there's always going to be a need for different game engines, because each game engine does something unique in its own way. And it might suit your project, or it might not. So you might have to write your own stuff, or hire some, or buy another license.
But like you said, game engines are kind of unique in the way they feel as well as a player. So, I mean, you can kind of tell like whether a game is a sort of Unreal game or a Unity game sometimes. What would you say makes Defold a unique game engine? Does it have a fingerprint or some DNA that, you can tell makes it a Defold game?
Not by the looks of the games. I mean, our focus has been on 2D games because that's what the King usually created.
Right.
It's a 3D game engine, but the tool set is for 2D games. I mean, one thing that you usually see in Defold games is that they start super fast because we have a very small engine. So there's not a lot of loading and a launch screen, and you hang there. But can you name anything that makes Defold stand out, Mattias, where you can see that it's a Defold game? I can't really think of anything.
I think when you compare it to Unreal Engine, etc., they usually have certain tool sets to work with visuals, but also depending on the skill of the team developing the game, they can create their own visual looks. So it might not be necessarily so that you can say that it's definitely an Unreal game or Unity game or whatnot.
Right. And you run the Defold Foundation as an open source foundation. And one of the things that I noticed when I go onto your website is you have a very active forum. Seems like you have it seems like it's important to you to have a community presence. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, that's one of the things that we pride ourselves in, that we have a very active and friendly community. And for us, I think we had a chance to really build a great community because we didn't grow very fast. So as I mentioned in the beginning, there was never any idea from Kingside to have a huge external user base. So we grew slowly, and while we grew, we always were present in our community, mainly in our user forum, and we run competitions, and we had quickly got some like Defold ambassadors. So we had some competitions in inviting the winners to GDC with all expenses paid and so on. So we quite quickly got like a core set of users who were real fans of Defold and really saw the benefits of working with Defold. And those have helped us from the start to build a community where you can come in and ask any question and you get a friendly reply from either one of us in the team or from one of the long-time members. And I think that's something that really makes Defold different, and it's something we're very proud of.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking at more maybe sort of diving deep into the technical side of things, I think that some of the things that makes engines stand out is that game engines are usually pretty opinionated about how to structure a game and how to build a game. If you look at, for instance, Unity, it's the whole entity component system. And so one of the things that I noticed when I was playing around with Defold is that there is a little bit of an opinion that Defold has. You're not allowed to read and write state of other game objects in the world. You need to coordinate that via message passing, sending a message to change stuff or asking for things sort of in return. Why is that, Mattias?
Well, basically it comes from using other game engines that have been very object-oriented. You have a huge scene graph with lots of objects. You might have a main character and lots of vehicles and houses and trees and exploding barrels and whatnot. And each rendered frame, you need to determine the state of something. Is the player in the air, or has the player landed on the ground, or is he on a vehicle? And what state is that vehicle in? And if so, we must change the state of that other object somewhere else in the scene graph to something else. And doing those things has several drawbacks. One is performance, since you can't really... the computer can't really determine what comes next, so it has to flush caches and load in new data, and in order to do these. So both performance and also maintenance, it's very hard to change or reiterate over that type of code. If you want to make a new game, you can't easily just grab that code. You need to really understand it to reuse it. So when the Defold engine was built, it was built in a way so that we could circumvent these issues entirely. So basically, not handing out the scissors to the end users so they can run with it,
Right.
but instead we hold the scissors inside the engine.
Yes, and I mean, performance is really obviously important in games. I think a lot of people don't really realize how hard it is to extract all of the performance from a game engine. There's a very tight budget in terms of what you're allowed to do in one frame of updates. All of the game objects need to update. All of the enemies need to sort of figure out what they're going to do next, and the physics component of the game engine need to calculate all of the bullets flying through the air, and you have a very tight budget with that kind of stuff. And so what Defold does is it sort of decouples synchronous calls from between game objects. You don't actually have to know right now what the state of another thing is. That could wait for a few more milliseconds of time. And it's an interesting approach, but it like if you're used to a very sort of procedural way of programming games, it can be kind of tricky to not be able to just read the state of an enemy from your player implementation, pretty much.
I mean, we use message passing in all the areas of the engine as well. I mean, so we have a physics system, and we use Box 2D or Bullet 3D. And when you get to collision, when we detect a collision, a message is sent to a script so that you can react to it if the script is attached to a game object which has a collider that can detect collisions, and you get a message back when the engine has finished playing an animation, for instance, or when a sound is finished. So we have this kind of asynchronous system built into the entire engine. So you find it in all kind of places. And if you're a game developer and you actually code the game logic, you can also send messages between your own systems, between your scripts. So when a player takes damage, you can send a message to your UI to update the score or something like that. So it's used throughout the engine. So it's both internal and internal within the engine and between the systems, and also available to the game developer. And as you said, Hans, it's quite different, and it's one of those things that new developers might find weird coming from a different engine. But it's once you get used to it, it's actually really powerful. It allows you to decouple things in a very nice way, and for the engine itself, it gives us some very nice advantages when it comes to performance.
Yeah.
I would also like to add that another reason why it's done this way, that we don't hand out the keys to the kingdom and to the user, is that we want a performant game from day one that you start developing. Because otherwise, a lot of the times when you create a game, you just make it work and you put more code in there and basically delay the optimizations until the end of the project. And so one of the key ideas behind Defold is to keep up with that, to always be performant from day one throughout the entire game or the development process.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, the tight budget that you mentioned for a frame, that you can obviously do it the wrong way in Defold as well, but we've tried to put in these kind of some might see it as limitations, but it's also there to help you as a developer to not go bananas and just write very code that is not performant at all, and then at the end of the when you come close to release, you have to spend months optimizing. So we've tried to put in these things that will help you as a developer not to go overboard.
Speaking of helping developers, since Defold is, I wouldn't say maybe primarily aimed at mobile games, but it is definitely something that the sort of origins of the game engines started up in targeting mobile games. Releasing updates on the Apple App Store can take between a day to a couple of weeks, depending on it's a review process. So anytime there's a review process or certification process, there is a time delay. So if you have a critical bug or a cool update you want to ship to your players, then it might be tricky to have that as a sort of mainline update through an App Store review process. But you have a way of sort of patching a live game through Defold?
Yeah, we call this feature Live Update. Basically, it comes down to once you export the game to be able to release it or upload it somewhere, we export it into two halves or two chunks, the main game and also a separate zip file with extra files that can be excluded from the first part of the game.
Right.
So once you actually run the game, you can figure out that, hey, this game is missing some resources, and now we can download them from a server. This allows us to keep the main bundle very small, which is good for app stores, and people like that. When they want to download new games from the app store, they look for smaller games because they have limited bandwidth or limited space on their devices.
Yeah.
But we didn't only target the mobile scene. Also, HTML5 uses it a lot.
Okay.
And I think the PC market can use it as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it's useful for all kinds of platforms. And I mean, as you said, Mattias, for mobile games, it's very important to have a small initial download. So that's why we have the feature. And I think one thing that makes it stand out a bit, I mean, this is not unique to Defold. So other engines can also do dynamic assets downloads and so on. But it's usually only assets. We can also download new scripts and things like that, which is kind of a gray area because downloading new scripts after release could be frowned upon by app stores. But anyway, I mean, we use Lua for the scripting language, so there's really nothing. I mean, you can download a Lua script and execute it in a Lua VM at any time anyway. So, but the live update feature allows you to download assets and scripts.
Yeah. And you recently announced that you are also supporting a Nintendo Switch. And that's also interesting because that includes some legal, issues, right? Because I don't think a lot of people understand how console supporting game engines work, especially if you have an open source or a source available game engine. So, Björn, what was it like to sort of start with that relationship with Nintendo to be able to support Switch on with Defold?
Yeah. So as you say, it's kind of different to develop for consoles. I mean, Mattias has a lot of experience with it, but Nintendo was the first one for me. And for consoles, there's a lot of secrecy around the SDKs and APIs, and everything is under a very tight NDA. You can't figure out anything about the Nintendo Switch APIs or PlayStation or Xbox without actually being approved by Nintendo in this case. So first we had to go through a certification process where we became an approved tools provider for Nintendo Switch, and then we got access to the SDKs and so on. But as you said, we also share our source code, and we can definitely not share the Nintendo Switch source code. So,
right.
So Nintendo Switch is just one more platform added to Defold, but it posted some problems for us since the source code is on GitHub. So how do we solve that? So yeah, we had to figure out ways around that. So we have a private repository with the Switch specific stuff, and then if you come as a game developer using Defold, you can't just get access to the Switch part of the code and the engine. You also need to get approved by Nintendo, and we get information from Nintendo that you're approved, and then we can give access to the game developers. So it's an interesting process, and it's very secret and all of that. And Mattias has more experience with it. Of course, Mattias actually did the hands-on implementation.
Well, I think you explained it pretty well. I think not a lot of users know that they need to apply to Nintendo to become a developer. They have to tell Nintendo about their team, their experience, and their game. And they might not, hold up to their standards, because if you compare the App Store on Nintendo, it's much smaller number of games if you compare it to the Apple App Store, for instance.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that. Right. But basically, I also want to encourage people to actually apply, because it's not that hard. It sounds scarier than it is. If you have a game, go for it.
Yeah, and I think that's the big that, like, if you have a game up front, then all of these big platforms are interested in talking to you. If you just have an idea and a couple of friends, then it's probably going to be a lot more difficult.
A lot more.
And I mean, if you already have the game and you're using a cross-platform game engine, it's usually not that hard to adapt it to the new platform. With Defold, we really try to minimize the amount of porting you have to do. So it should basically just be to rebuild it for a new platform, and it should work. So if you have the game running on mobile, you might have to think about landscape versus portrait mode and so on. But other than that, it should basically just be to build for Nintendo Switch, and you should have the game running on your Switch dev kit. It shouldn't be much harder.
Also think about joysticks.
Yeah.
That's basically it.
All right. We are at the sort of the tail end of the current generation of consoles, and we're looking at some new consoles and some new versions, major versions of game engines coming out as well. What do you guys see as the future for game engines, tech-wise and business-wise? Is there something happening in this landscape right now?
I think there's always going to be room for game engines that doesn't target the absolutely newest and most fancy console. I think, I mean, especially in terms of, the latest rendering capabilities and pushing the boundaries of what the console can manage. So I think there's room for all kinds of game engines in this new space. So even though there might be new consoles coming up, there's also room for the whole retro 2D games. That's always going to be a thing, I believe. But it's probably a big challenge, to always have your game engine up to date with the latest console developments. It's not a small undertaking to support a console. It's a lot of work as a game engine developer. Mattias, I think you have experience working with PlayStation, for instance, various PlayStation versions.
Yeah, I mean, there's always something new going on, but I think perhaps the consoles themselves, once you have ported the engines to support the features, I think that's one thing. Usually, for a new console, you have to think about porting the rendering pipeline to use the console's rendering API or the input, joysticks or a keyboard or whatnot. But once you have actually done that, the idea is that the engine should work as it used to be on the previous generation, right, but perhaps with more features or more triangles on the screen and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But I think a bigger issue is if you're using these newer engines and the newer consoles, people might expect more and more triangles and more content on screen, because more computing power allows for that. You can have more AI characters running around on the screen. And where a couple of years ago, Assassin's Creed game could have, I don't know how many they have, I shouldn't mention the number, but I think like 400 animators. They might need a lot more. That's just animators.
Right.
The rest of the level design, making buildings and
game content is absolutely getting more and more expensive to produce, because we're building sort of cinema level quality game assets for games now. So, and I don't think we have the same kind of budgets.
Those parts are definitely moving away from the indie developers. They can't really afford to create such content. So therefore, I think we'll always see the need for performance game engines that have, lower specifications, what they can do,
right,
but people are fine with it. Yeah. So they get a more stylized look instead.
Interesting. So where can people go then to read about the Defold Foundation and the Defold game engine?
So the website is a good starting point, defold.com. So there we have all of the learning materials, some bullet points on product features if you want to do a comparison. The user forum is a good place as well, so forum.defold.com. So we encourage people to go there. And also if you want to learn more about the foundation, because that's a special setup. We're not a company, we're a foundation, so we have some specific rules and limitations governing what we can and cannot do, but that's for the benefit of the Defold community, actually.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you guys for taking the time to come talk to me, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. Thanks.
Thank you all for listening. If you want to see more episodes of this podcast, please check out patchandcrash.com. Also, follow us on Twitter @patchandcrash, where we post about new episodes or live streams.